This story happened to me while I was serving in the Air Force, and it was during my time at a military base that was famous for its supernatural reports. I'm not going to mention the name of the base, but if you know the area, you've probably heard some of these stories. It was one of those old bases with lots of isolated areas, deserted dirt roads, and a dark past. Many of us servicemen, like me, arrived for duty and were immediately met with stories that kept you up at night. One of the most famous involved a peculiar figure, a man in a top hat, who, according to reports, would appear on a narrow, isolated road that passed near a storage area. This road, especially at night, had a different vibe. The wind seemed to whisper in your ear, and the silence was so thick you could hear your own heartbeat. Like many others, I was skeptical, but I couldn't help but feel a chill down my spine the first time I drove through there. You never expect something to actually happen, until it does. They said this top hat man would appear in the corner of your eye, always distant, standing at the side of the road, as if waiting for something or someone. The detail that disturbed me the most was that no one could describe his face. It was as if he were just a shadow, a silhouette from another time. The veterans always said to avoid that place at night, and anyone who didn't would end up sharing stories that made your heart race just hearing them. Some said they saw the figure standing in the middle of the road. Others claimed he followed them from a distance, keeping up with the car as if gliding over the ground. And when they looked in the rearview mirror, he vanished. I always thought these were just stories to scare the newcomers, until the night I did a patrol along that road. The silence was terrifying, and the radio, which usually buzzed with some static, was dead silent. At that moment, I felt like I wasn't alone. Something caught my eye. I slowly turned my head, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. The man in the top hat, motionless, standing at the side of the road, staring at me in a way that chilled me to the bone. What happened next? Well, that's a story for another time. But I can guarantee one thing. There are places that hold more secrets than we're ready to discover. And on that base, everyone knew that at night, the past came to life in ways you couldn't explain or forget. The problem was that on that base, you had to patrol no matter the time or place. And guess what? The road that passed near that storage area was on my route that night. It's funny how silence can be so oppressive. I've always been the type to appreciate the calm, but that road was different. Every sound the truck made seemed amplified, and the headlights barely lit the first few feet ahead, as if the darkness around was thicker than usual. Then we saw that infamous road. We called it Echo Street. The place was so deserted it seemed forgotten by time, with tall trees bending over as if trying to envelop you. By this point, I was used to nighttime patrols, but something about that night gave me a bad feeling. My partner was driving, and I was checking the structures with my flashlight. We were near the final curve, the one where they said things happened, when suddenly the silence became almost physical. The truck's engine seemed to muffle, and even the faint sound of music on the radio started to fade. There was no wind, no sound of insects or birds. It was like the whole environment was holding its breath. When we reached the spot where they said the girl had fallen and died, I turned my head to the window, trying to shake off the irrational fear that was growing inside me. That's when I heard it. A faint moan. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the truck. It was a human sound, distant but so close at the same time that it seemed to be between us in the vehicle. My body froze. It was like a cry of pain, something so deep that it stirred me in a way I had never felt before. I turned to my partner, thinking he was messing with me, trying to lighten the tension. "Dude, stop it," I said, almost laughing nervously. But he looked at me, confused, not understanding what I was talking about. Then I realized he had heard it too. That's when the fear really set in. Whatever it was there around us on that road. And somehow, I knew it wasn't the last time we'd hear that sound. My partner looked at me, still confused, and then I turned off the music on the radio, trying to listen more closely. The silence returned, heavier than before. And then we heard it again, that same moan. Only this time it was louder, clearer. It sounded like it was coming from all directions, as if it were inside and outside the truck at the same time. It was like we were surrounded. I couldn't find any words, and from the look on my partner's face, he was just as terrified as I was. Without saying a word, he started easing off the gas, slowing the truck down. "What is that?" he muttered, his voice almost trembling, and I had no answer. The sound came back, long and drawn out, and this time I felt my blood truly freeze. It was like something was choking whoever was making that sound. It was impossible to ignore the fear it brought. The strange thing was we were both hearing exactly the same thing. It wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't exhaustion or paranoia. It was real. And the more we tried to understand, the clearer it became that something was very wrong on that road. For a moment, we were paralyzed. Stupidly, maybe waiting for it to happen again, as if we could rationalize what was going on. And then it came again. Louder, closer. That desperate moan, almost like a muffled scream, as if it was coming from the very air around us. That's when my partner, without even looking at me, slammed the truck into gear and sped off like never before. I nearly lost my balance in my seat, and he took the curve so sharply the truck almost tipped over. But in that moment, none of that mattered. We knew one thing: we had to get out of there. Running away from that place was the only thing that made sense. We didn't say a word, but we both knew that whatever happened there wasn't something we were meant to face. I had never felt such an urgency to leave a place. Every second felt like something invisible was chasing us, as if that road wanted to trap us there. My partner was driving like his life depended on it, and in that moment it probably did. We reached the barriers, those big, heavy ones that always took forever to open and close. I jumped out of the truck before it even came to a full stop. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys while struggling to unlock the padlock on the first gate. My partner stayed in the truck, glancing around as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows at any moment. The sound of metal creaking echoed through the air as I pushed the gate open, and for a brief moment, I had the overwhelming feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. I knew I had to be quick. I ran back to the truck, but there was still the second gate. I quickly closed the first one and turned to the other, fear pulsing through my veins. Every second that passed made the darkness around us feel denser, more oppressive. As soon as I managed to open the second gate, my partner gunned it, speeding out without hesitation. I barely had time to close the second gate behind us before jumping back into the truck. He didn't stop. We didn't look back. The silence that had been unbearable was now filled only with the sound of the engine. And it wasn't until we were far from that road, back in the main part of the base, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. But the fear didn't disappear. Even being far from that place, something continued to haunt me. I could feel it. And when we met up with our flight chief, still trembling, expecting him to laugh at us, he just looked at us with a grim expression and said, "I believe you. That's happened to me twice." When the flight chief said that, my partner and I exchanged a look of pure shock. He believed us. Worse yet, he had gone through something similar, not once, but twice. In that moment, the reality of what we had faced started to settle in a way neither of us wanted to accept. It wasn't our imagination. It wasn't the exhaustion of a long patrol. Something real was out there on that road, near that storage area, and we weren't the only ones who knew about it. The flight chief told us that one of those times he was also on a night patrol. He described the feeling of being watched, like something invisible was always just out of sight but undeniably present. And then he asked about the moans. The same moans we heard, that weak, chilling cry that made your blood run cold. He said the first time he thought he was losing his mind, but the second time he realized it wasn't just in his head. What he didn't know, and this was what disturbed me the most, was what was causing it. He had never seen anything concrete, never had an explanation. Just the certainty that something was there, something that only appeared to a few. He still avoided that area after dark. In fact, he even joked, somewhat bitterly, "You did what everyone does. You ran. And you did the right thing." That last sentence left me uneasy, because as much as we knew we did the right thing by running, the question that kept gnawing at the back of my mind was, what would have happened if we hadn't? After the flight chief told us that, the tension between my partner and I eased a bit. But the truth was, the fear never really left. It was just waiting for the right moment to resurface. Going back to our daily routines was hard, especially because every time night fell, I was reliving those moans. And worse, the memory of what my partner and I heard wasn't the scariest part. It was the silence right before, like the world around us was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A few weeks passed, and we tried to avoid that storage area as much as possible. But the base was big, and sometimes patrols took us back to that region, even if it wasn't by choice. Every time that happened, my muscles would tense up, and I'd stay alert, waiting for any sign, any noise. And then one night it happened again. We weren't anywhere near Echo Street, but we were a few miles away in a similar, still isolated area. The radio was on, playing softly, and everything seemed normal. We were chatting about nothing in particular, just passing the time, when suddenly, the sound came back. That same moan, weaker this time, but unmistakable. I immediately looked at my partner, and he was already staring back at me, eyes wide. We both knew exactly what we were hearing. The problem was, we weren't on Echo Street. We were in a different part of the base. The sound seemed to be following us, following the base. It was like whatever presence was there wasn't confined to just one place. Maybe it was part of the entire area, something ancient, tied to the base itself, and we were just the newest ones to sense its presence. The moan came again, louder this time, and panic gripped us. Just like the first time, we didn't waste any time. We didn't exchange words. We didn't need to. We floored it, getting out of that sector as fast as we could. The sound faded behind us, but the feeling that we were never truly alone didn't. From that moment on, I realized that whatever was out there, it was all over the base. It wasn't just a story about an isolated road or a dead girl. It was something bigger, something that could manifest anywhere, for anyone who was caught off guard. That second time really shook me. The idea that the sound, that moan, could follow us to other parts of the base made me feel like I could never truly be safe, no matter where I was. My partner and I never openly talked about it, but it was obvious in our faces, in the way we tensed up whenever night fell and we had to get back to work. Then I started noticing that we weren't the only ones going through this. Other airmen began sharing similar stories, and what was most unsettling was how these stories seemed to be becoming more frequent. There were reports of entire teams feeling the same presence, hearing the same moans, and the pattern was always the same. The silence before the sound, that oppressive quiet that seemed to announce what was about to happen. Some of the older guys who had been at the base for years started talking more openly about it. It was like, after so many decades, the stories had become a kind of local folklore, but with one crucial detail: all the accounts were eerily similar. There was always an isolated area, an unexplainable sound, and that feeling of something surrounding you. What made me even more uncomfortable was realizing that some people would stop talking abruptly when pressed about their experiences. You could see in their eyes that there was more they weren't willing to share. It was like, after all these years, they had learned that talking about what happened at that base only attracted more of it. And over time, that idea started to take root in me too. The more you talked about the sound, the more it seemed to appear. It was almost as if the base itself was alive, reacting to the stories being passed around. So I began to shut down too. I kept conversations light and avoided mentioning what my partner and I had experienced. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. As the months passed, I became more cautious. I avoided that part of the base as much as possible, especially at night. But the feeling that something was always lurking never completely left me. And there was always that question spinning in my mind: what would have happened if we hadn't run? It was like a shadow following me, a doubt I couldn't shake. Whatever that presence was, it didn't seem interested in just making its presence known. There was something more, something we never found out because we always ran before things could escalate. But what if we hadn't run? Would it have fully revealed itself? That was the part that haunted me the most. Every time I remembered the sound, that moan, that wail, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to tell us something. Like it wasn't just a typical haunting. Maybe, in some way, it was a warning. Something trapped in that place, trying to communicate with us, or worse, trying to trap us too. I thought about that every time we went back to that road. Even though there was no choice, it was part of the job. Each time we got near that sector, I could feel the adrenaline pumping, the growing fear that one day, maybe we wouldn't be fast enough to run. Because deep down, I knew that someday things might be different. What if, on that night, the road didn't let us leave? The entire base seemed to hold its secrets. And those of us who lived through these experiences carried the weight of something that no one outside of that base could understand. Eventually, I was transferred to another unit, and I'll admit I was relieved to leave that place. But the truth is, even now, I still have nightmares. Nightmares about that road, about that sound. And deep down, the question remains, what would have happened if, that night, we had stayed? I was in the prime of my youth when I was drafted for the Vietnam War. Like many others, I had no idea what was waiting for me there. It was a completely different world. A suffocating jungle where the enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But what no one prepared me for was what I encountered beyond the battles and gunfire. It wasn't just the Viet Cong we feared. There was something else in that forest. Within the first few weeks, I started hearing rumors of strange things happening. Soldiers whispered quietly, as if they didn't want to attract the attention of whatever it was. It wasn't just the fear of human enemies that haunted the camp. There was something in those dense jungles, something that couldn't be explained by the normal rules of war. I heard stories of patrols that simply vanished, of sounds in the middle of the night with no source, of shadows that seemed to come alive and watch your every move. I remember an older soldier, Sergeant Miller, who had been there for months when I arrived. A tough guy who had seen it all. He pulled me aside one day and said in a low voice, "Listen, kid, the enemy you can see with your eyes is easy to face. The problem here is the things you can't see, the sounds that don't make sense, the places where the jungle feels like it's swallowing you up." I laughed nervously at the time, thinking it was just another veteran trying to scare the rookies. But after that first night, I was never the same. In that jungle, silence was as deadly as gunfire. And sometimes, when everything seemed too quiet, you could feel a presence. Like the forest itself was alive, and something within it was watching our every move. It wasn't the kind of fear you could fight with a weapon. I remember that after a few weeks in the field, I was assigned to an area that was said to be particularly dangerous. Not because of the Viet Cong, but because of something that felt different. It was a part of the jungle that all the soldiers avoided talking about. There were whispers that near some old enemy camps, strange things would happen. It was as if the jungle had a dark side. When we walked through it, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. And it wasn't just paranoia from the war. You could feel it in your skin, a presence that weighed on your shoulders. The trees closed in around us, and the air seemed to get thicker. The few times we passed through that area, I had the sense that the jungle itself was watching us, as if it were alive. Veterans often talked about that place. One of them, a guy I respected a lot, swore up and down that there were shadows moving between the trees. But they weren't enemies. He said the shadows were wrong, distorted. They move in a way that's not natural, he'd say. And I, with my radio on my back, trying to keep calm, would just listen quietly, not sure what to believe. But deep down, I knew something was off. There were reports of soldiers who swore they'd seen Viet Cong bodies lying on the ground in strange ways. No bullet wounds, no visible damage. Just dead, as if something had drained the life from them. Others spoke of a deep silence, where even the sound of your own breathing felt wrong. And I just wanted the patrol to end quickly, because every second there made my heart beat faster. In that part of the jungle, the silence was different. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was like the whole jungle was holding its breath, waiting. And then came the order. I was being transferred to a different unit, led by a man named Officer Douglas. There was no choice. Orders were orders. When I met Officer Douglas, something about him unsettled me. He was different from the other commanders. He had a distant look in his eyes, like he'd seen things he shouldn't have. When he told me I'd be the new radio operator for his unit, a chill ran down my spine, but I didn't question it. We boarded a helicopter, and soon we were flying over a part of the jungle I had never seen before. The area was dense, far more so than any other place I'd been. It looked impenetrable, almost like it wanted to keep us out. When we landed, I was taken to an improvised camp where some soldiers were already stationed. But the strangest thing was the atmosphere among them. They didn't talk. They barely moved. And what unsettled me the most was that they didn't seem to be afraid. Fear was a constant in Vietnam. Everyone had a little bit of it. But these guys, they didn't react. Not when we passed by the remains of Viet Cong huts. Not when we heard noises coming from the jungle around us. It was like they were oblivious to everything. I tried to strike up a conversation with one of them, asking him what he was doing there. But he just looked at me with a vacant stare, as if he was seeing through me without actually seeing me. It was a look I had never seen before, void of emotion, void of life. I was shaken, and when I asked Officer Douglas about it, he just told me to go back to my tent and wait for further instructions. That night was the longest of my life. Even though I was surrounded by soldiers, the silence was absolute. The only sound was the wind through the trees, and somehow even that sound felt wrong. I should have stayed in my tent, but curiosity and unease were too strong to ignore. With each passing second, the feeling that something was deeply wrong there grew. So, against my better judgment, I left and walked through the camp, trying to understand what was happening. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the camp, inside a tent larger than the others, something strange was going on. I approached quietly, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, there was an improvised table, and on it were 6 large containers. It was hard to believe what I was seeing, but there were heads inside those containers. The heads of Viet Cong soldiers. They were submerged in some kind of green liquid, with wires and tubes coming out of their mouths and eyes. But what really knocked the wind out of me was the fact that these heads moved. It wasn't my imagination. Their eyes and mouths twitched, as if they were somehow still alive. I felt panic rising inside me, a mix of horror and disbelief. What kind of macabre experiment was going on here? Who were these people and why were they doing this? Before I could process it all, I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was Officer Douglas. His face was stern, and he didn't seem at all pleased that I was there. "You shouldn't be here," he said with a coldness that froze me to the bone. I stammered a question, wanting to know what the hell they were doing with those heads. But he simply ordered me back to my tent without offering any explanation. As I walked back, terror consumed me. What had I just seen? And the scariest part, why were those soldiers acting like nothing was out of the ordinary? When I returned to my tent, my body was still trembling. I couldn't get the image of what I had seen in that tent out of my head. The heads, the wires, the green liquid. It all seemed like something out of a nightmare. I sat there, on the floor, with my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But nothing added up. It was far beyond anything I had ever heard about in the war. The worst part was Officer Douglas' behavior. He seemed to have absolute control over what was happening, but there was something deeply wrong about him. It was as if he knew things the rest of us could never imagine. And the other soldiers around. The more I thought about it, the more I realized they didn't act like normal people. They seemed like robots, emotionless, fearless, just following orders mechanically. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up with excruciating pain in my chest. Everything around me was dark, and my vision was blurry. I felt a weight on my body, like something had hit me. I tried to move, but the pain was unbearable. That's when I realized I was in some sort of makeshift infirmary with several other soldiers around me. My muscles ached, my head throbbed, and my lungs felt heavy, like something was wrong. Officer Douglas was nowhere to be seen, nor were the other soldiers I had seen before. It was as if I had been left there, forgotten. No one explained what had happened, but based on the injuries I had, it seemed like I had been hit by something. Maybe an ambush, maybe something worse. I couldn't remember anything after he sent me back to my tent. While I was recovering, I was told there had been an enemy attack the night before, but I couldn't recall any of it. The last clear memory I had was of that tent with the heads and the twitching eyes. After that, everything was a blur. I kept wondering, over and over, what really happened that night? The scariest part was that I never saw Officer Douglas or those soldiers again. The days that followed were confusing and disturbing. My body was still healing from the fractures, but my mind was completely lost. I tried to piece together what had happened that night, but everything was a blank after I left that tent. I asked some of the medics about the enemy attack, but none of them seemed to know exactly what had happened or how I ended up in that infirmary. And what bothered me the most was the disappearance of Officer Douglas and the other soldiers. No one knew who he was or where that unit had come from. It was like they had never existed. I talked to my superiors, but all I got were vague responses, as if no one wanted or could talk about it. I started to feel like I was alone with that memory and the weight of what I had witnessed. The images of the heads in the containers kept haunting me, and the strangeness of those soldiers, fearless, emotionless, left me even more unsettled. I knew something was very wrong, but any attempt to find answers was met with silence or evasion. No one wanted to touch the subject. I started to think that maybe Officer Douglas wasn't even his real name. The way he appeared and disappeared without a trace made me question everything I had seen. Who was he really? And what was he doing in that tent? Were they trying to extract information from the dead Viet Cong? Or was it something much darker? Every time I tried to talk about what I'd seen, I was quickly interrupted or ignored. It was as if people knew, but were too afraid to dig deeper. The truth is, in Vietnam, it wasn't just the human enemy you had to fear. There were secrets buried in that jungle, and I had the misfortune of stumbling upon one of them. Even though I couldn't fully understand what I had encountered, the sense of isolation grew stronger with each passing day. The more I tried to find answers, the more I realized that the people around me were shutting down. It was as if everyone knew something was wrong but didn't want to talk about it. The war itself was already a heavy enough burden, and maybe the other soldiers preferred not to question the unexplainable. But I couldn't let it go. There were moments when I wondered if it had all been in my head. Maybe the stress of the war, the tension of being in such hostile territory, had made me see things that weren't there. But then I'd remember every detail of that night. The eerie silence in the jungle, the unmoving shadows of those soldiers, and, of course, the heads in that tent. Those memories wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't find any explanation that made sense of what I had seen or experienced. That's when I started talking to other veterans who had been stationed in that specific area. When I brought it up, most of them quickly fell silent, but a few gave me that same look, the one I had seen in Officer Douglas' soldiers. That vacant, distant look, as if they had seen something they'd rather forget. One of those veterans, back in the States, told me something I've never been able to shake. He spoke quietly, almost like he was confessing a sin. "You're not the first to ask about this, and you won't be the last." And then he told me about other units that had disappeared in that same area, always under mysterious circumstances. Soldiers who came back different or never came back at all. That's when I realized that what I had experienced wasn't an isolated event. Something was lurking in the jungle, something beyond the war, beyond what any of us could understand. And while I had survived to tell the story, many others weren't as lucky. After that conversation with the veteran, everything became clearer to me, and at the same time more terrifying. I wasn't the only one carrying this burden, and what had happened in that jungle wasn't a one-time event. But the worst part was, the more I thought about it, the more one question kept haunting me, one I couldn't ignore. What if I had stayed in that tent? I wondered all the time what would have happened if I hadn't gone out to investigate that night. Would I have simply disappeared like so many other soldiers who were sent into those strange areas? Or would I have become one of those empty men, fearless, lifeless, like the ones I saw around Officer Douglas? Maybe I had been part of some experiment? Or worse, maybe I was never meant to survive. That uncertainty began to consume me. I tried to move on, focus on my duties and get back home, but there was always this nagging feeling that somehow I had narrowly escaped. And that left me unsettled, because deep down, I knew that what I had witnessed wasn't the end of the story. There were more things happening in the jungle, more secrets that would never be revealed. I was transferred to another unit shortly after, and I have to admit I was relieved to leave that area. But even being far away, the memories continued to haunt me. I dreamed about that tent, those emotionless soldiers, and the heads that were somehow still alive. And Officer Douglas. His cold, calculating face always appeared in my nightmares, reminding me that I would never have all the answers. I knew I would never see that place again, but part of me also knew I'd never be completely free of it. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't truly escape from there. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried in the jungle. But one thing is certain. Vietnam left scars on me far beyond the battles I fought. Some of those scars, you just can't erase. It was early morning when the distress call came in. Our unit, Alpha, was on patrol in a remote area, far from any main base, when the radio started crackling with a strange message. It was a cry for help from Bravo, a unit that had disappeared weeks ago without a trace. No one knew what had happened to them. It was as if they had evaporated into thin air, with no signs of a struggle or evidence of an ambush. What unsettled me the most wasn't that they had resurfaced, but the content of the message. They weren't asking for help like any group of soldiers in danger would. There were no cries for backup, no gunfire, nothing indicating a combat situation. All that came through the radio was a sequence of numbers. 5, 8, 2, 4, 7. And then static returned. The radio repeated the same sequence over and over, like a broken record. And with each repetition, something inside me twisted. It didn't make sense. They weren't coordinates or any code we recognized. Just numbers, echoing into the silence of the night. Sergeant Davis was beside me, and I could see from his face that he felt the strangeness of it too. "It's Bravo, man. But what the hell do these numbers mean?" I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking louder might awaken something unwanted around us. Davis stayed quiet for a while, eyes fixed on the radio before replying, "I don't know, but we've got to find out." Little did we know at the time that the sequence of numbers would be the least of our problems. We decided to push forward, advancing through the thick fog that seemed to swallow everything around us. The air was heavy, dense, and the silence was so deep that even our footsteps sounded muted. The headlights from our vehicle only cut through the fog enough to illuminate a few feet ahead. As we approached the abandoned Bravo base, the sense of unease grew. When we arrived, something was very wrong. The structures were there, but everything felt desolate, as if time had stopped. Broken windows, doors hanging ajar, overturned furniture. Everything indicated that things had gone very, very wrong. And the worst part, there was no sign of life. We moved in silence, rifles in hand, trying to make sense of what had happened. The place, which had once been a hub of activity, now felt like a ghost town. The buildings stood, but all traces of life had vanished. And there were no signs of a fight, just an oppressive emptiness. What really started to mess with my head, though, was the sequence of numbers that grew louder the closer we got to the command center. 5, 8, 2, 4, 7. The numbers repeated endlessly, like a curse, coming from the radios still left on. The same sequence over and over. It was unnerving. Sergeant Davis whispered for us to stay sharp, and I could hear the fear in his voice. Something about this place felt off. The base was too quiet, the numbers kept echoing, and the deeper we went, the more I felt like we were being watched. Like something or someone was waiting for us in the shadows. As we moved further into the base, everything seemed to close in around us. The thick fog, the crumbling buildings, and that damn sequence of numbers on the radio. It felt like we were walking straight into the unknown. Davis signaled for us to approach the main building, the command center, where the transmission of the numbers seemed strongest. We entered slowly, weapons ready, and the air inside was even heavier. The place was a mess. Overturned chairs, papers scattered everywhere, the smell of dust and something else, something metallic. Blood? I didn't want to think about it. Sergeant Davis led us cautiously, and each step seemed to echo in the crushing silence. And then, in a corner near the communication equipment, we saw them. The bodies. Members of Bravo. But they didn't look normal. There were no bullet wounds, no signs of struggle. They were just lying there, on the floor, with expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. Eyes wide, mouths open as if screaming when death claimed them. It was a sight that made my stomach turn. We tried to piece together what had happened, but nothing made sense. Sergeant Davis knelt by one of the bodies and muttered under his breath, "No signs of a fight. What the hell killed them?" He didn't have time to answer his own question before Lee, one of ours, pointed to a corner of the room. There, lying on the floor, was the body of Commander Haskins, Bravo's leader. He was clutching a notepad tightly in his hand, his fingers rigid in death. Davis moved over, carefully prying the notepad from his grip, and that's when we saw it. On the paper, in the same shaky handwriting, was the sequence of numbers: 5, 8, 2, 4, 7, and right below it, in larger letters, a short, terrifying phrase, "They're coming for us." It was as if the air in the room became even more suffocating at that moment. The phrase was a warning, Haskins' last attempt to alert us. But about what? And more importantly, who had come for them? I turned to Davis and saw the same fear on his face that I was feeling. We were in a situation that no amount of military training could have prepared us for. In that instant, the weight of Haskins' words, "They're coming for us," settled into our bones like a cold we couldn't shake. We stood frozen, processing what we had just seen. Who were they? Sergeant Davis stared at the notepad for a few more seconds before giving the order to keep searching for answers. But we all knew that something was terribly wrong. We decided to leave the command center and search for more signs around the base, even though all of us wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. It was a decision driven by a need to understand what had happened to Bravo, but also by the growing fear that the same thing might happen to us. Heading toward the base's laboratory, according to the reports, Bravo had been working on some kind of special research before they disappeared. When we arrived, the door was hanging off its hinges, as if someone or something had torn it open with brute force. Inside, the smell was even worse, a mix of chemicals and decay. My eyes immediately fell to the floor. There were more bodies, more soldiers from Bravo, and what shocked me was that, like the others, there were no signs of a struggle. No gunshots, no open wounds, nothing that would suggest a battle. They were just lying there, in positions that suggested they had died suddenly, with the same terrified expressions we had seen in the command center. What disturbed me most was that the laboratory was full of broken vials, spilled liquids, and scientific instruments scattered everywhere. It was clear that something had abruptly interrupted whatever experiment had been going on. And then, in the corner of the room, we found a table covered in notes. Davis began flipping through them quickly, and as he read, his face grew paler with each page. "My God!" he murmured, not lifting his eyes from the paper. I moved closer, trying to see what Davis was reading, and then I saw it. The notes detailed a secret project, something involving radio waves and mind manipulation. Bravo had been working on experiments that weren't fully documented in the reports we'd received. It had to do with transmitting numerical codes, the same numbers we were hearing on the radio. At that moment, I realized the sequence of numbers wasn't a call for help. It was a warning. The understanding that the sequence of numbers was more than a distress signal, but a warning hit us like a cold, hard slap of reality. The air in that lab grew even heavier. Sergeant Davis dropped the notes and looked at me, his face a mix of restrained desperation. "They were messing with something they should have never touched," he said, his voice low and almost trembling. Everything began to make a disturbing kind of sense. Bravo hadn't disappeared because of an enemy attack or the treacherous jungle. They had tampered with forces beyond our comprehension, and now we were facing the consequences. The radio waves, the numbers, the mind manipulation, it was as if Bravo had triggered something that couldn't be contained. A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered Haskins' warning. "They're coming for us." But who were they? And were they still nearby? Every instinct in me screamed that we should leave immediately, but Davis was determined to uncover more about what Bravo had unleashed. As we continued searching the lab, the feeling of being watched grew more intense. Lee, who was monitoring the communications, shifted uncomfortably with the radio in hand. "Davis," she said, her voice tense. "The transmission. It's changed." I frowned, and Davis grabbed the radio, pressing it to his ear. What had once been a repetitive sequence of numbers had now become something else. There was a kind of static, like a background murmur, mixed with the numbers but distorted. It was hard to understand, but it seemed like someone or something was trying to communicate in another way. 5, 8, 2, 4, 7. The voice on the radio droned, but now there was a louder noise behind it, as if another frequency was interfering. It was almost like something alive was moving through those radio waves. Davis looked at us, and with an air of almost desperate determination, he gave the order. "That's it. We're getting out of here now." He had barely finished speaking when a sound echoed from outside. A subtle noise, almost imperceptible, like something moving through the fog. When we heard it, the world seemed to stop for a moment. It was a low sound, like the rustling of leaves, but in the absolute silence of the deserted base, it sounded like a thunderclap. Our survival instincts kicked in. Davis signaled for everyone to be on high alert, weapons ready. But what unnerved me most wasn't the sound itself. It was what it represented. We weren't alone. We left the lab slowly, scanning the surroundings with our eyes, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The fog around us seemed thicker, almost suffocating, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And then I felt it, that unsettling sensation of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was something real, something you could feel in the air, like an invisible presence stalking our every move. As we moved toward the vehicle, the radio on my belt began to crackle again. The sequence of numbers returned, but this time the voice sounded clearer, as if it was closer to us. 5, 8, 2, 4, 7. The persistent static was interspersed with another sound, quieter, almost like breathing. I glanced at Davis, who was tense, his eyes fixed on the fog ahead. "Pick up the pace," he whispered. Then we saw it. A shadow emerged from the mist, moving slowly toward us. It was humanoid, but there was something wrong about it. We couldn't make out details, just a vague silhouette, as if it was cloaked in the fog itself. Cold fear gripped me. "Davis?" I whispered, trying to alert him without raising my voice. He had already seen it. We all had. The shadow stood still for a moment, as if it was observing us too, and the radio went silent. None of us dared breathe. For a few endless seconds, we stood there, frozen, waiting. And then, without warning, the shadow took a step toward us. "Run!" Davis shouted. Without a second thought, we turned and bolted toward the vehicle. Fear drove us with a strength we didn't know we had. Behind us, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, but unmistakably following us. The fog seemed to close in around us, making the escape even more frantic. In the distance, we finally saw the faint glow of our transport's lights. The run felt endless, but the terror of being caught by that thing pushed us forward. Something was coming for us, just as Haskins had warned. We ran as if our lives depended on it, because they probably did. The vehicle grew closer, but the feeling that the shadow was closing in on us was impossible to shake. The footsteps behind us continued, slow and heavy, as if the shadow wasn't in a hurry, because it knew sooner or later it would catch us. When we finally reached the vehicle, Davis nearly threw himself into the driver's seat, and I jumped into the back with Lee. The engine roared to life, and without hesitation, we sped off. The sound of the tires spinning in the mud was music to my ears. The relief of being in motion, of escaping, almost overwhelmed me, It was when I looked out the rear window that the terror came crashing back. The shadow was still there, standing in the fog, watching us. It didn't move, but the mere fact that it had followed us to that point was enough to make my heart race again. Lee was panting beside me, her eyes locked on the same spot, as if she expected that thing to follow us once more. "You think we got away?" she whispered, not taking her eyes off the shadow. I didn't know what to say. There was no way to know. The radio, which had been silent until then, crackled again. 5, 8, 2, 4, 7, the sequence of numbers over and over. But this time there was something different. It was as if a new voice had joined the transmission. A whisper, low, almost imperceptible, but carrying with it a feeling of indescribable dread. Davis was driving as fast as he could, his eyes focused on the road ahead. But even as the fog began to clear, I knew we weren't safe. That shadow, that presence, was still with us somehow. The radio started to crackle louder, and the whisper that accompanied the numbers became clearer. It was a single word, repeated softly, almost like a lament. "Come back!" I looked at Davis, who now had a pale, haunted look on his face, and saw that he had heard it too. No one said anything. There was nothing to say. We were being called back. The shadow didn't need to chase us. It knew that, eventually, something would bring us back. As the vehicle gained speed and the fog slowly faded behind us, the silence inside the car was suffocating. No one dared to speak, as if giving voice to what we had just witnessed could somehow bring it all back. But the truth was, even though we were far from that base, the terror stayed with us. The radio, though quietly crackling, still repeated the sequence of numbers, and that disturbing whisper, "Come back," seemed etched into my mind, echoing with every breath I took. Davis finally broke the silence. "We can't just leave it like this," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the road, but his voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. "There's something bigger happening here. Something that started with Bravo, but now it's pulling us in too." I wanted to tell him we had made it out, that we had escaped, but deep down I knew he was right. This wasn't just about distance. Whatever had been unleashed at that base, whether it was through the radio waves, the numbers, or those twisted experiments, there was no real escape. We were tied to it now in a way we didn't fully understand. Lee glanced at me, her eyes filled with fear, and I knew she was thinking the same thing. What were those numbers? Who or what had come for us? And worse, why us? Haskins had tried to warn us, but his message was incomplete. Just fragments of a terror he hadn't had time to fully understand himself. We reached the relative safety of the main base by dawn, but there was no real sense of relief. As we climbed out of the vehicle, the radio finally went silent, but the quiet didn't bring peace. Davis turned to us and said, with a firmness that barely masked the fear we all felt, "We need to figure out what these numbers mean. If we don't, it's going to happen again. And next time, we won't be so lucky." But deep down, I knew he was wrong. This wasn't about luck. Whatever was connected to those numbers, those transmissions, had already marked us. No matter where we went, the fear wasn't behind us. It was ahead. As the sun rose, casting a weak light over the gray sky, a sense of dread settled deep within me. This wasn't just the end of a mission. It was the beginning of something much larger, much darker. Something that I felt would never stop chasing us, no matter how far we ran. Because they had come for us. And somehow I knew that next time, there might be no way to escape.